the Sceptre Staff. My name is Daniel Vallis, and welcome to our channel. In our last video, we talked about the shepherd's crook, how it's also interchangeable with the scepter and the staff, and how it's a picture that's laid out for us, particularly with the story of redemption and the lamb and the great shepherd. And we also see it portrayed in the heavens too as well, this picture of the scepter and the staff, tied to the great shepherd and the story of our redemption. And we're going to learn more about the staff today and look at it to make sure that we're not just seeing things in the heavens. No, we're going to look at shadows and patterns that we're given that we can recognize distinctly that this is part of the celestial sign, and it's going to be recognizable as we dive into God's Word. We study the story, the patterns, and the shadows that were written for our learning, and as we learn more about the tapestry of redemption. We will have a clearer idea of what we're supposed to be looking at when we do look up, when we do lift up our heads. And that will clue us in to the timing that our redemption is drawing nigh. Genesis 49:10. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. The scepter shall not depart from Judah. This is the main condition of this whole prophecy. And our understanding of what the scepter is will help us have a better understanding of the prophecy. Now, most times today in our modern learning and understanding and just our familiarity with certain literary depictions of royalty and kings, we often think of a scepter as something very ornate and very beautiful with lots of gems and gold and very ornate scepters. But we also recognize that there's some more decorative functions, such as this Persian scepter here. But it still has a feeling of royalty to it from our perspective. But we're going to learn today that not all scepters fit into our concept of scepters, what they look like. It's what they represent. When we look up what a scepter is, we find out that the wasps and other types of staffs were signs of authority in ancient Egypt. For this reason, they are often described as scepters, even if they are not full-length staffs. Kings were also known to carry a staff, and the staff with the longest history seems to be the Hequa scepter, sometimes described as the shepherd's crook. So note that of all the different types of staffs and scepters that there were, the one with the longest history is the shepherd's crook as a scepter. Very interesting. And when you do a little bit of digging, you'll find that the shepherd's crook was used in a variety of cultures to represent the scepter. Up in the left, you could see it used in Babylonian motifs sometimes, but primarily it was used in the Egyptian, although you also find references on Phoenician coins to the scepter as a shepherd's crook too as well. And so when we look into the heavens and we see a shepherd's crook, we are not just seeing something or just seeing what we want to see. We are seeing a biblical and historic pattern that the scepter would be expected to be in the shape of a shepherd's crook. And this is what we see, and particularly when we understand the story of where it started with the story of our shepherd and our Redeemer, who was at that same point also filling the Shiloh prophecy too as well, and in connection with redemption and the bride. This scepter staff is not just something we're seeing. It has biblical and historical weight. That is the most common depiction of the scepter. We can look up and we can see the scepter in Judah. And we can also see it still between the feet too as well. And we can see how the scepter staff was used to measure out the sections of the sky and also used to delineate the constellations from the Chaldean perspective. Jupiter marked the different divisions, but it also measured them too as well. And we find the length of this scepter staff proportional to what a shepherd's staff is. But I found it amazing that even from the Babylonian Chaldean perspective, they viewed Jupiter, the role of Jupiter, as it went through the sky and marking out the different boundaries. They even considered Jupiter's role as a shepherd. We talked about how Nibiru was a point in the sky, a crossing point. And there are different theories about exactly what that means. But notice how they had Jupiter as Marduk, their god. But particularly that point was considered what guided the other stars. It set the boundaries for them. And they considered Jupiter, its role at particular points, as shepherding the other stars like sheep. This was the picture that they had in their mind, a shepherd and sheep. And so when we look back at this prophecy and what's going on in the celestial heavens right now, even just with a simple view of the stars, our understanding of just what a scepter is, we could see the scepter and where it's at. So now that we understand a little bit more about what a scepter is, it is a shepherd's crook, and that's the longest historical understanding of a scepter, as a shepherd's crook. So when we look back at this passage, the scepter, the shepherd's crook, shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come. And unto him, Shiloh, who's going to be the great shepherd, shall the gathering of the people be. When we look at an astronomy chart for Virgo and the area of Leo too as well, again notice that they're using a different depiction of Virgo. There's so many different depictions. We should not base your prophetic view on a particular shape. Use other evidences to have a more concrete view of that. But with a little observation and charts like this, we can easily see where the scepter would be, where the shepherd's crook would be, based on what we understand about Jupiter and its role as the scepter and the lawgiver who also marks out the boundaries. And we can see the scepter, the shepherd's crook, laying there at the feet of Judah, even just with our modern understanding of where Leo is. That's the more common shape of it. And then some depictions also have the leg extended a bit because it is a pretty big lion. But we also know that Java was viewed by the Chaldeans and the Babylonians as the rear foot of the lion. So we don't know exactly how it connected up, but just for our purposes today, we'll just draw a little line there to represent the hind leg. And you could see the staff, the scepter, is between the feet still. That's still in the Judah segment. And we don't know all the Chaldean stars and the depiction exactly with their concept of the woman, just we know for sure right now that it's Spica and Porima were their key stars for it. So we have an idea of where the body is, the main torso part. And then even just looking at it from our modern perspective, we could see where the scepter, where the shepherd's staff lays. And even when we consider it from the modern International Astronomy Union charts, the official charts, the scepter staff is laying outside of Virgo's body. But notice how it's ending right pretty close to it. That's where the next equivalent opposition point would be. Once we have a better idea of what we're supposed to be looking for in the sky, what we're supposed to identify when we do look up, when we do lift up our heads, we'll have a clearer idea of the sign that also ties in with our understanding of the picture of redemption and how it is drawing nigh at this time. And it goes back to our understanding, doing some digging, finding out more depth of the clues that are given to us in the prophecy. And particularly noting how the scepter, the longest history, seems to be from the Egyptian perspective with the shepherd's crook. And most people are familiar with King Tut as one example of the shepherd's crook. And then also the shepherd's flail too as well. But this was a very common scepter that they used because just like all the other kings in the other cultures, the pharaohs regarded themselves as a shepherd king, a shepherd of their people. And so they used these two instruments of a shepherd, the shepherd's crook and the shepherd's flail, to represent their role and their authority. The flail was the equivalent representation of the whip that they used with their herds and their cattle. The dual equivalents for our purposes would be in Psalm 23, thy rod and thy staff. With sheep, the shepherds would have more of a club instead of a whip, and they would use the club against enemies and wild animals, and sometimes if they had to chasten the sheep too as well. There are two instruments of the shepherd, and for the Egyptians it was the crook and the flail. And this perspective of the scepter as a representation of a shepherd's crook tied to royalty, particularly from an Egyptian perspective, helps us better understand the Shiloh prophecy. Let's look at the passage a little bit more in depth. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, thou art gone up. He stooped down, he couched as a lion. And as an old lion, who shall rouse him up? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come. And unto him shall the gathering of the people be. Now who gave this prophecy? It was Jacob, who was a shepherd. He was very familiar with the shepherd's crook. And you can read about his past in Genesis 30, where he worked for Laban as a shepherd. He worked for a number of years as a shepherd. So the one who gave this prophecy was a shepherd who understood what a shepherd's crook was and what it represented. It's also interesting in Haggai 12:12, and Jacob fled into the country of Syria, and Israel served for a wife, and for a wife he kept sheep. And by a prophet the Lord brought Israel out of Egypt, and by a prophet was he preserved. And of course, keep in mind Jacob's other name was Israel, so that's used interchangeably here to represent him and his offspring. But notice how it mentions Jacob served for a wife, and for a wife he kept sheep. There's a connection of this shepherd who purchased his wife by being a shepherd. A beautiful picture of our Redeemer, Shiloh, whom Jacob prophesied about. Shiloh was the great shepherd who laid down his life for his sheep, who paid the bride price for his wife, and for a wife he kept sheep. And by a prophet the Lord brought Israel out of Egypt. Do you remember the other prophet that God used to bring the Hebrew people out of Egypt? He used Moses, who was also a shepherd, who was also royalty too in Egypt too as well. But keep in your mind how Jacob, the one who gave the Shiloh prophecy, was a shepherd who kept sheep so he could get his wife. And he's the one who made the Shiloh prophecy, but we also need to remember his sons were also shepherds. And there's different passages that talk about where they kept their sheep and the cattle. So all of Jacob's sons, whom the blessings were directed to, were also shepherds. And that also included Joseph as well. He was a shepherd, very familiar with the shepherd's crook. Genesis 37:2. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and with the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. So Joseph was used to feeding the flock. He was used to being a shepherd. And take note, he was 17 years old when they sold him into slavery. And so he is very familiar with being a shepherd. And so, in context of all these shepherds, when we understand that Joseph had the dream about the 12 stars, how they bowed down, and we talked about their connection with the different constellations representing the 12 sons of Jacob, we are starting to see some connections, how these shepherds are connected to the stars. But then, of course, we know that Joseph was sold into slavery, and he went to the land of Egypt. And he went there when he was 17 years old, and he lived there the rest of his life. And of course, the land was very dominated by the Sphinx, so he became familiar with that very quickly. But then, if you're familiar with the story, Joseph eventually met Pharaoh, the shepherd king, who would be carrying a scepter staff. And so we don't know exactly how long Joseph was in that Egyptian culture before he noticed the connection of the representation of the shepherd's staff that he was very familiar with that of royalty and as a scepter. And you'll remember the first time that Joseph met Pharaoh. He was interpreting a dream for him. Genesis 41:39. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, Forasmuch as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand, and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had, and they cried before him, Bow the knee. And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. Joseph, the humble shepherd who became a shepherd ruler. Joseph was made ruler in Egypt second only to Pharaoh. Joseph would also have his own shepherd's crook scepter as well. The king was usually most associated with the shepherd's crook, but is also sometimes used by high officials and noblemen too as well. But particularly Joseph, who would be the second ruler and even rode in Pharaoh's second chariot, he himself would also have a shepherd's crook scepter. But then as you read more in the story of Joseph, eventually Jacob came down to Egypt. Jacob the shepherd came to the land of Egypt, where his son Joseph was the ruling shepherd. And when he arrived in Egypt, Joseph, the shepherd ruler, introduced Jacob the shepherd to Pharaoh, the shepherd king. Genesis 47:1. Then Joseph came and told Pharaoh and said, My father and my brethren and their flocks and their herds and all that they have are come out of the land of Canaan, and behold, they are in the land of Goshen. And he took some of his brethren, even 5 men, and presented them unto Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto his brethren, What is your occupation? And they said unto Pharaoh, Thy servants are shepherds, both we and also our fathers. They said moreover unto Pharaoh, For to sojourn in the land are we come, for thy servants have no pasture for their flocks. For the famine is sore in the land of Canaan. Now therefore we pray thee, let thy servants dwell in the land of Goshen. Now Joseph hadn't brought in his father yet, but he brought in 5 of his brethren. And notice the conversation that is going on. his brothers, who are shepherds, are talking to the shepherd king about sheep and shepherding. And just notice how in just these few verses, the big emphasis on sheep and shepherding, and when you consider the roles of the people who are talking, it's all about shepherding and tying the two ideas together, the shepherding and the kingship, the shepherd king. Remember, in this context too, Joseph is standing there as well. He's also a shepherd king, standing next to the shepherd king Pharaoh, who's talking to shepherds. It's all about shepherding. Going down to verse 5, And Pharaoh spake unto Joseph, saying, Thy father and thy brethren are come unto thee. The land of Egypt is before thee. In the best of the land make thy father and brethren to dwell. In the land of Goshen let them dwell. And if thou knowest any men of activity among them, then make them rulers over my cattle. And Joseph brought in Jacob his father, and set him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto Jacob, How old art thou? And Jacob said unto Pharaoh, The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have the days of the years of my life been, and have not attained unto the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh, and went out from before Pharaoh. So again, here, right after he had talked to 5 of his brethren, who were shepherds, Pharaoh, the shepherd king, was introduced by Joseph, the shepherd ruler, to Jacob, the shepherd. And let this impress upon your mind. Jacob, the one who gave the Shiloh prophecy, is face to face with Pharaoh, the shepherd king, holding a shepherd's crook scepter. Jacob was very familiar with what the scepter was when he made the Shiloh prophecy. His own son held the shepherd's crook scepter, and Jacob himself talked face to face with Pharaoh, who also held the shepherd's crook scepter. Genesis 47:26. And Joseph made it a law over the land of Egypt unto this day, that Pharaoh should have the 5th part, except the land of the priests only, which became not Pharaoh's. And Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions therein, and grew and multiplied exceedingly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. Take note of several things. First off, Joseph made laws. Joseph, as the ruler who held the scepter, Joseph was the lawgiver. And then, secondly, notice that Jacob, his father, lived in Egypt for 17 years. He was very familiar with the culture and the pictures there in Egypt, particularly with his son being the second ruler in all of Egypt. And so keep this in mind. Jacob lived there for 17 years. He fully understood what the scepter was, what that picture was, what his son's idea of the scepter was, and he also had an understanding of what a lawgiver was as well, because the main role model was his son Joseph. So Jacob lived in Egypt for 17 years. Genesis 49:1. And Jacob called unto his sons, and said, Gather yourselves together, that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the last days. Gather yourselves together, and hear, ye sons of Jacob, and hearken unto Israel your father. And so Jacob, the one who had lived most of his life as a shepherd, told his sons to gather themselves together, to gather themselves in obedience, and to gather themselves together physically unto him, so that he could tell them what would be happening to them in the last days. Jacob the shepherd gathers his sons one last time, which would include Joseph, the second ruler of all of Egypt. And as the second ruler in all of Egypt, he most likely had the shepherd's crook scepter with him at this meeting, if not very close by, held by one of his attendants. And so Jacob gathers together all of his sons who are still shepherds. And remember, Pharaoh asked Joseph to set some of his brethren in charge of Pharaoh's flocks, whoever was responsible. So they had their own flocks, and then some of them had jobs working for Pharaoh with his flocks too as well. This is a gathering of shepherds and a shepherd ruler. And the Shiloh prophecy was directed toward Judah, who was a shepherd. And he fully understood the pictures that Jacob, the shepherd, would be using in the blessing that he would give to Judah. And we have to keep in mind, to understand the Shiloh prophecy, we have to consider the Shiloh prophecy context. Where were they when the Shiloh prophecy was given? The Shiloh prophecy is talking about a lion couched. It's talking about a scepter. It's talking about a lawgiver. It's talking about a gathering. They're in the land of Egypt, which has a gigantic stone lion in it. These people have been to numerous events with Pharaoh over the 17 years that they've been there so far. They're very familiar with the shepherd's crook as a scepter. Their own brother is the second ruler in all of Egypt, who no doubt has his own scepter, shepherd's crook as well. And they're all shepherds themselves, some of them working for Pharaoh, the shepherd king. And so when Jacob tells Judah, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. Their understanding of the Shiloh prophecy was molded by the context of where they had been living for the last 17 years, and by their own brother, who was the second ruler of Egypt, who was a shepherd ruler and a lawgiver. They knew full well what all these pictures represented. And on top of that, Jacob was familiar with Joseph's dream about the stars that we know from later prophecy is connected to the scepter. The scepter is going to be represented in the heavens by a celestial sign. Our understanding of this prophecy grows deeper the more we study the biblical context of when this prophecy was given. The scepter is a shepherd's crook. And so when we look into the heavens and we see connected with Shiloh, the lion, the scepter, the shepherd's crook, we can positively identify what we're supposed to be looking at, particularly as we anticipate the gathering of Shiloh's people. Shiloh, who is our Redeemer, is also the great shepherd, who holds the scepter, who holds the shepherd's crook, and is one day going to gather the wife that he purchased when he paid the bride price, the price of redemption. And as we study scripture about the story of redemption, we see how all these come together so beautifully. And we could see that the day of our redemption is drawing nigh. Lord willing, we are going to continue this study in our next video, so please stay tuned. But in the meantime, download the Shiloh booklet. We have made several updates. We have also shuffled things around so that the sections of Finding Judah's Border and also our learning journey are now in the back as appendixes so they could be updated more readily without having to print out the entire booklet again. So definitely download the new booklet, which does include this new material about Joseph and the scepter, the shepherd's crook. That is now included in the learning journey too as well. So definitely download this and study it, and stay tuned for our next video. Maranatha.